Hi, I'm Dan Kado, and today I'd like to talk about prices in model railroading. If you're going to build a layout, obviously there's going to be different expenses involved. The trains themselves, track, wiring, wood or whatever you're using for your bench work and support structure. In this program, I am going to focus mostly on the trains themselves. And I'd just like to talk about it a little bit and maybe add to the discussion or maybe, start a conversation. I'm not out to provide any definitive answers because I don't know that there are any. I certainly can't answer for anyone else how much is too much. I know when I do product reviews, a lot of times I'll get a comment about a model being too expensive or something to that effect. And, it's hard because everybody's got a different amount of money that they can spend. There's the things that you have to spend money on, like food, rent, your mortgage payment, car insurance, whatever. And then, whatever's left over becomes discretionary money that, and there's a lot of competition for your discretionary dollars. There's a lot of different interests that people have. People like to play video games. People like to go golfing. People like to go skiing. People like sports cars or motorcycles. There's all kinds of different things that can be competing for those dollars. So I think it's maybe could be interesting to keep model railroading prices kind of in the context of that same set of things, because what's too much for one person might be not expensive for somebody else. And what's too expensive can vary on the interest. Like if you're really, really interested in golf, for example, and you want to go play on some ritzy course, that can cost a lot of money from what I understand. I don't play golf, but, I've heard that the fees can be quite high. I wouldn't do that because honestly, I suck at golf. I've tried it and it's not pretty, but anyway, on the other hand though, I'm willing to buy trains because that's my interest. So, depending on what your priorities are, I live within a reasonable driving distance of Levi Stadium. And I can remember when the Niners were in the playoffs recently, the nosebleed seats were like hundreds of dollars a seat. And they went up from there, and I don't like sports that much in general. So there's no way I would pay that kind of money to see anybody really. But a lot of people were willing to pay the prices and they had a good time. So, it's like, there's no right or wrong answer, but I think it's something to think about. So before we get too far into this, I want to talk about the biases on this channel and my own personal biases, which are kind of intertwined. I've been in model railroading since I was a toddler. I got my first trains when I was 3. For Christmas, I got a little N-scale layout, and I don't remember exactly what it looked like, other than it was on a piece of green painted plywood. But it had some track, it had a couple of switches on it, and it had a little Arnold Rapido 060 N-scale engine and some cars. And that was like one of my best Christmas presents ever. I really, really had a good time with that. And I've been in the hobby ever since. I don't have those particular trains anymore, but, I've always had trains basically, through high school, through college, everything. There have been times in my life when model railroading has been, I don't want to say less of a priority, but I've had other things have taken precedence, but it's never gone away. I've never stopped doing trains at any point. And when I was, I think in my late teens, I started getting into HO scale, and I was attracted to HO because of the possibilities for detailing. Also the size, I kind of like the bigger size, even though I still have N scale, I still like N scale, but the larger trains also have an appeal. Every scale's got its own appeal. But I wanted to do diesel detailing because I was reading articles in magazines and stuff about that. And, in HO, there were so many more parts available, and it was just an easier proposition to do that in HO. So I started getting some HO models, and that kind of got me going on the journey that I'm still on. But, I've always had a preference for high detail. That's kind of been something I've liked the whole time. So, you know, I can remember, I think it was in the 90s or maybe late 80s when like the Intermountain cars started to come out and they had more detail, and I started to really like that. And then as time has gone on, more and more stuff has come out with freestanding ladders and separately applied grab irons and all that kind of stuff. So over the years, I've kind of sold off most of the older cars that I had that had like molded on ladders and all that kind of stuff in favor of cars that are more accurate and more detailed. So that's what I get now, you know. So those tend to be at the higher end of the market, the locomotives with more detail and more accuracy, the freight cars with more detail and more accuracy. Those are going to command higher prices than other models that maybe are more generic and maybe have molded on parts. So there's nothing wrong with any of it. I'm not trying to judge it, but I'm just trying to, this is my preference. So you know, if you're judging prices by what you see in my product reviews, it's going to skew toward the higher end of the market. And I just think it's important to acknowledge that, and acknowledge that there are other trains available that don't cost as much. Not everybody is super into the detail like I am, and I understand that. But that's just my own preferences, so I thought it was important to mention. So sometimes when I do a product review, the comments will be something like, you know, oh, back in the day, you know, you could get a train for this, you know, or whatever. So I think it's really important to take inflation into account. And I don't want to open up a political can of worms, so please, I'm asking nicely, please. If you want to do that, you know, there's other places on the internet you could discuss those things. I will say, because I did a little research, and I will say, if anyone's inclined to go off on a rant, to just please remember two things. One, inflation has been around pretty much since people invented money, like since ancient times, okay? Through many different political systems, you know, empires, monarchies, democracies, you name it. So it's something that's been around for a really long time through many different changes in leadership and that kind of thing. The other thing I would ask people to keep in mind is that inflation is a global phenomenon. It's not something that just occurs here in the United States. It's everywhere. And in fact, I found this little chart that showed rates of inflation, and the rates of inflation in the developed nations like, you know, Europe, the US, Australia, Japan, is actually lower than some other places where it's extreme. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But anyway, you know, just maybe keep those things in mind. I'm not bringing it up to start a political discussion, but just because it is a fact of life, and because if you want to compare a historical price to a current price, you really have to take it into account for that comparison to be meaningful. And I got thinking about this actually because of one of the viewers of this channel asked me a question. And it was about a train I knew nothing about. Anyway, he asked me a question that I had no idea how to answer, so I had to do some research. And the question was about this little kit for, I think it was a trolley car or an interurban car, and I think it was by Soydam, if I'm saying that right, I'm not sure. But anyway, this person said that they'd bought one in the early 70s for $65. And I think, it's been a while, but if I'm remembering right, they still had the kit, but some parts had gone missing, so they were looking for another one because I guess they wanted to build this model. And the person found one on eBay for like $400, and they were like, "Is that a good price?" Well, I had never heard of the model. I had no idea what to say to this. So I actually did some research, and I went to the fountain of all knowledge, Google, and I started researching inflation a little bit. And lo and behold, maybe some of you already know this, but to me it was new. There's things on the internet called inflation calculators. And they allow you to put in an amount of money and a date, and they will give you an amount of money on a different date. So I thought that was pretty neat. And I tried a few of these, and they all seem to give you more or less the same numbers. Some of them work with averages, like a yearly average, and some of them go to a specific month. So there can be a slight difference in the result, but overall they were pretty close to each other, so I would say that probably any of them would give you the answer. But anyway, so I went and I put in $65, and I said, well, January 1970 is about as early 70s as you can get, so I use that as the date. And lo and behold, it was about $500. In fact, I think it's gone up a little bit since the first time I tried this. So maybe that $400 price wasn't so bad, you know, in that context. So I think it's really important to kind of keep inflation in mind. And I know for myself, you know, I don't have an instinctive grasp of this. You know, I think about having 20 bucks in high school, and it seems like it's the same as having 20 bucks now, but it's really not, because the 20 bucks in high school had a lot more buying power. So another example I have of this is this N-scale Concord PA1. Now I repainted this model in my North Coast scheme, I think in the 80s, when I first was trying to do the North Coast idea. But it was originally SP in Black Widow. But anyway, be that as it may. These were, I'm going to go ahead and say that these were the best diesels you could get in N-scale at that time. And I have two of these, and I ran them both to death. I actually wore them out. My grandfather had a little layout in his garage. It was basically a double-track dog bone that just went up and down the garage. And I would put both of these engines on the track and just as many cars as I could put together and just run them for hours. And I did that, you know, often, because usually my mom would want to go visit her parents like once a week, and I'd go down with her, and we'd spend most of the day down there, and I would run trains, and my mom and her mom would go to shop for clothes or whatever. My grandfather and I would run trains or go to a hobby shop or something. So it was, I was like super fun for me at the time. But what's interesting about this is that I actually saved the price sticker in the box. So I bought this at a place called the Whistle Stop hobby shop in San Jose, which is no longer there. It's been gone for a long time. But I bought it on September 30th, 1978, and I paid $32.98 for it. So putting that number into the inflation calculator, it's about 150 bucks in today's money, which is interesting because I think you can get the newer version of a Kado PA1 in N-scale for less than that. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I know certainly I've bought I don't have any of the modern Kado PA1s, but I have other Kado N-scale engines, and I don't think I paid $150 for any of them. They were all like, between 80 and 100. So in a sense, in terms of buying power, the price is actually lower, if you account for inflation. So it's something to think about. So another thing I think is important to keep in mind is that the nature of the models themselves has changed. Like, for example, this old PA1, when the front truck pivots, the pilot pivots with it, which I guess is something they did to try to make this go around sharp curves. The modern versions of this, the pilot is part of the body like it should be. It doesn't swivel, just the truck swivels. The mechanism, too, is much different. The modern Kado mechanisms have flywheels. They've got a circuit board that can be easily swapped out with a DCC decoder. I mean, DCC wasn't even invented when this engine was produced. There were some primitive command control systems back then, but nothing like what we have today. And not with the capabilities of all the lighting and sound and everything else that we can do nowadays. That kind of stuff just didn't exist. Similarly, this is a Scale Trains rivet counter SD38-2 model. This is a Southern Pacific engine, and it's got a lot of details like uncoupling levers and hoses and see-through fans and all that, but not only does it have a high level of detail, but it's actually unit specific. I have two of these, and my model of 2971 doesn't have a beacon on the roof. My model of 2975 does. And there's other stuff on here that's specific to this particular unit. So, back in the day, you couldn't buy this in plastic with that kind of detail and accuracy. There was no such model. There was no such thing. This boxcar is another example. This is a Rapido boxcar. This is an SP B100-40 class car. And again, this isn't just a generic boxcar with a Southern Pacific painted on it. this is an accurate model of that particular boxcar class. And, there was nothing like this, back in the old days in plastic. The closest thing you would have found back then would have been brass. And even brass models, I could probably do a video on brass models, and maybe I will at some point, but not all brass models are created equal. And a lot of times, the brass models, you would still have to paint them, and you would still have to oftentimes work on them so they would actually operate well, because a lot of the brass models didn't have the greatest underpinnings. Like I've got a few brass models, and like some of the cars don't roll too well, some of the engines don't run too well. So there's things with brass. Just because it's brass doesn't mean it's great. But that was about the closest you could get to that kind of stuff in those days. And even then, like the locomotives, they would have just had DC motors. There was no DCC ready, any of that. So the hobby itself has come a long way. And so, when you're talking about, what you paid for an Athearn Blue Box SD40-2 back in, 1985 or something versus what you would pay for like a Scale Trains SD40-2 today, again, you're not really comparing apples and oranges, because they're two very different things. One's got a lot of detail, the other one has all molded on everything. I know the Athearn SD40-2 in its day was good because they had a scale width hood, and they left the grab irons off so that you could install them yourself without having to like carve off the molded on grab irons and then have to repaint the ends of the model. So that was kind of a big deal back in the days, but it's still nothing like what we have now. So I think that's another thing that's kind of important to keep in mind. So speaking of Athearn Blue Box SD40-2s, these three are ones that I've built. And you might recognize Santa Fe 5126 from back in the day when I was elsewhere on YouTube. I also have its sister unit 5111 and a Canadian Pacific X Sioux-Line unit. I've tricked these out about as much as I think it's possible to trick out a Blue Box engine. They've all got DCC and sound and LED lighting and tons of detail parts, and I would stack these up against anything that I've bought from like Athearn Genesis or Scale Trains in terms of the detail level. However, I have a rule of thumb that all engines cost $300. If you buy like a Scale Trains rivet counter or an Athearn Genesis engine with sound and DCC, that's about more or less what they're running for these days, is around $300, give or take a few bucks. These Athearn Blue Box engines can sometimes be found relatively cheaply if you shop around on eBay. However, the can motor that I use, the Mishima motors in these things, I don't even use them anymore because they've gotten so expensive. You can almost buy a whole model for the amount of money that you spend on the motor. The sound decoders are, $100+. Then you add in the speaker, you add in the LEDs for lights, you add in all of the detail parts, Canon cab, Canon sub bass, front end, all of the fans, handrail stanchions, details west parts like plows and things, and other parts from Detail Associates. And by the time you add all that stuff up, it's easily $300, worth of parts. And that's to say nothing of the labor. I don't know what it took me to build these engines, but let's say it was like 60 hours. Even if I paid myself like $20 an hour to build something like this, that would still push the cost up to like about $1,500 by the time you add in the parts too. You can do it yourself, and you can save money sometimes doing it yourself, but you kind of have to evaluate, those other costs that might be a little more hidden, like all the costs of the detail parts and all the costs of your time. Now, like for me, and probably for a lot of people, this is a hobby, and spending the time doing that is enjoyable, so I don't mind. But, it's still something to think about. So I'd like to touch on the subject of collector trains just briefly. I'm not a train collector, so, you can take this for what it's worth. I generally, though, wouldn't recommend investing in model trains thinking that you're going to sell them later for a huge profit. That can happen, but you really have to know your stuff. There are like collector guides for older brands like, Lionel, like old Lionel or old Marklin, some of the brands, American Flyer, that have been around for a while. And you really have to be kind of brutally honest about the condition, because If it's something that's been played with a lot and the paint is all scratched and the original boxes aren't there anymore, it's not going to be worth as much as one that's like, was taken home from the store and put in a closet and never looked at again, and it's still in its original box and, is pristine. That's going to be worth a lot more. So you kind of have to really know that stuff. As an example, this is a Lionel 252 engine shell. I have the rest of it. This was actually my dad's. And I took it apart years ago wanting to restore it because it was in not the greatest condition. But I ended up painting it the wrong color, and then I kind of put it aside and thinking that I'd get to it again someday. I did actually recently find the right paint for it. It is a greenish color, but it's not this green. This is actually Chicago and Northwestern green. This is flow quill paint. So not the right color for this engine. The actual color is it's called Peacock, and it's a lot lighter and with a little bit of blue in it. And apparently Lionel made them in the green, and they also made yellow ones because I did a little research, and those are kind of pretty common. They don't command super high prices, even though they were like made in the 30s. Then there's another one though that I found that was a maroon color that was apparently only sold in certain department stores, and I can't remember off the top of my head which store. It was like Macy's or something, but I don't think it was Macy's. But anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is that those are more rare. So those, if you have one of those, it's potentially worth more money because they're rare. So I mean, any collectible, it all has to do with rarity and desirability. You have to have something that's not common, that there aren't a lot of them left, right? And it also has to be something people want. So if it's not both of those things, it's not going to be super valuable, So I would also another thing I learned is that stuff that's marketed as collectible generally isn't. When I was with my first wife, when her father passed away, we inherited a bunch of these collector plates, those plates that people buy to hang on the wall and they have some scene art thing painted on them or whatever. And he had tons of those, thinking that they were going to be worth all this money someday. And I think we ended up giving them away to a charity because we literally couldn't find anybody who wanted them for any price, no matter how low. So I see like little commemorative train sets and things, and I wouldn't advise generally buying one of those thinking that it's going to be worth a lot of money someday, because most of the time it probably won't be. There is another type of train collecting which has to do with more model railroader type of models, like the stuff that I would buy. Almost everything in the industry these days is limited production. That's been for a couple of decades at least now. And the model manufacturers will make a certain quantity of something and then that's it. And then maybe someday they'll rerun it, but they probably, like if it's a diesel, they'll rerun it with different numbers or a different paint job or something. So you won't get the exact same one again, typically. So sometimes those models, if there's something that people want, especially if it's a railroad that's popular like Southern Pacific or Pennsylvania or something like that a lot of people want, those can appreciate in value just because there's a large demand among the modeling community for those particular models. But again, you really have to know your stuff. So I wouldn't recommend just going to a hobby shop and buying a bunch of random trains and thinking that that's going to make you a fortune someday. So let's talk about modeling on a budget. I've been there. There have been different times in my life when I've had more or less money to throw at trains. And, so I get it that, sometimes things are expensive and sometimes you don't get to have everything you want because, it just costs too much. I still have to worry about, what I'm buying. I don't buy everything under the sun. In fact, I buy less now than I was buying because for a while there I was trying to be more appealing in terms of making YouTube videos by buying a lot of trains that were not just Southern Pacific, But I'm not doing that so much anymore. I've kind of been narrowing the focus of my buying to just stuff that's relevant to the projects that I'm trying to do, which is one of the strategies for modeling on a budget, is to pick something as a theme and then stick with that. If you pick something as a theme, then that helps you to kind of steer clear of other stuff that doesn't fit that theme. So like me, I'm modeling Southern Pacific's Donner Pass line in the 1990s. So that means that I'm not going to buy, like a New York Central engine from 1955. Nothing wrong with that. It's very cool, but it has no relevance to what I'm trying to do on my particular layout. So I can ignore stuff like that. So that's a strategy, is to narrow your focus. Another thing is to allocate a certain budget for yourself, and that's something, of course, it's again very individualized. But if you can put away a little bit of money every month toward your train budget, then you can kind of work with that and say, okay, well, I want this particular locomotive. It's going to take me 2 months to save up for it, and then after that, I'm going to buy this freight car or something, and this structure kit or something like that. So if you can plan some kind of a budget like that, then you can work with that to try to assemble enough things to have a decent model railroad. Another approach is to sell off models that you don't want anymore. That's something I've been doing recently, and it's something I've done in the past as well. Taking models that maybe like the ones that I don't really want anymore, that have like molded on stuff. I don't have many of those left because I've already kind of gotten rid of those. But you can take those and sell them and then use the money to buy more trains that you do want. I've been selling off some of my project diesels and trains that I just don't feel like are a good fit for what I'm doing anymore. And then you can take that money and then use it for putting it toward something that's more relevant to the layout, even if it's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be a train. It could be bench work, it could be wiring, it could be anything. But that's something that you can do. Value-added services are another thing. I used to do custom graffiti. That was one of the ways I got rid of some of those cars that I didn't want anymore. I would do my own graffiti tags, and that was a big deal on eBay for a while, was selling weathered cars with that were all tagged up. I don't know if people are still doing that so much, but for a while there, it was a way to make a little bit of money. I could take a car, sell it for more than I paid for it, and then use that money to buy more trains that I did want. Another thing that I would really, really like to emphasize is quality over quantity. You are better off with one really good locomotive and a few freight cars that work well than you are with a box full of 100 junky trains. That one good locomotive is going to be reliable, it's going to run smoothly, and you're going to be able to use that to operate and actually do the hobby. You don't necessarily need to have more than one. You could start with one, and later on down the road, if you get another one, then you could maybe run another train, or you could run both of them together or whatever. But if you're just getting started, getting a good quality engine is, I think, really important. It doesn't have to be DCC. There's a lot of DC locomotives. I think if you go with a brand like Athearn or Kado or Atlas, NHO, those are good ones that you can get, if you shop around, can get with a reasonable price. And they run really well for the most part. One thing that occurred to me, and it seems kind of obvious now that I thought about it, so maybe it's occurred to some of you as well, is that all locomotives do basically the same thing. They move themselves and other railroad equipment. That's really it. They go forwards and backwards, and they have couplers so that they can connect to other pieces of railroad equipment. They can push or pull. Sure, some of them are designed for certain jobs like switchers or passenger engines. Some are bigger and some are smaller. Some are powered by steam, diesel, or electricity. Some are highly specialized, like an RDC, which combines the function of a passenger train and a locomotive into one package. Really, though, regardless of any of that, they do the same thing. They might have lights, and most of them make some kind of noise. Many of our models reproduce that. But that stuff is secondary. The main function is to move rolling stock, and in doing so, move freight or passengers. So with that in mind, you can get by with one or a few locomotives and do most of the same things that people with a larger collection can do. In terms of operation, a train pulled by one locomotive with a few cars is not really that different from a really long train with 6 or 7 diesels on the front and a couple of helpers or DPUs further back. Both kinds of trains still have to get permission to occupy the main, they have to obey signals, and in general follow all the rules of the road just like any other train. So if you're on a budget, keep that in mind. You don't need a massive fleet of equipment to enjoy model railroading. Another thing that I would say is that model railroading often comes down to managing resources. You know, your resources are not only money, but also space and time. You have to have some mix of all three of those in order to be able to build a model railroad. You have to have some money, you have to have some space, even if it's not a lot. Like this module that I'm standing in front of is only 2 feet wide and 5 feet long. And I did a little lap session video on it recently that's here on the channel if you want to watch it. But you know, you can actually, you know, you can run something like this. It can, you know, and if it was a little bit, maybe just a little bit bigger and had a couple more switches, it would be a really cool little switching layout that could keep you busy for a really long time. So, you know, managing resources and also time. And by time, I mean the amount of time you have to devote to the hobby. So, you know, you could have a warehouse-sized building and, you know, millions of dollars in your bank account. But if you're, you know, a new parent with a kid and an 80-hour-a-week job, you're probably not going to have a lot of time for model railroading, I'm guessing, you know. So, you know, you've got to have some time that you can spend. You have to have some place that you can use, even if it's not a very big place. The need to have a huge room for model railroading is a myth, okay? You can do a lot with a small space. And you can do a lot with relatively little money. But you have to have some combination of those things. One of the things I would suggest is, if you're on a budget, also is to adjust your expectations to match your budget. You know, maybe your dream is to model Pennsylvania's, you know, 4-track main line through Horseshoe Curve and maybe Altoona or something. Or maybe you want to model Union Pacific's North Platte Yard. You know, both of those are really high traffic areas where you're probably going to need a lot of locomotives and a lot of cars and, you know, tons of room. And, you know, that's an expensive proposition. And if you're on a shoestring budget, that's probably not realistic. Now, if you like Union Pacific, for example, you could model a UP branch line somewhere, maybe only need 1 or 2 engines and a few cars. You're still modeling the railroad that you like, but you're just doing it in a different scale. You know, not scale as in the size of the models, but scale as in the scope of what you're trying to build. So, and you know, I wouldn't reject that idea out of hand if you know, because a small layout can actually be really fun, you know, and you don't need a lot of cars, you don't need a lot of places to spot cars in order to have fun with trains. You know, you think about it like, you know, all of the things that a long train can do, short trains can also do. You know, if you spot a car on a siding, it's the same operation as if you spot a cut of 4 or 5 cars on a siding. You know, it's just you're doing it with a shorter consist, you know. Same thing if you have 2 trains meet, you know, one takes the passing siding and the other one holds the main. It doesn't really matter if the trains are 100 cars long or 5 cars long. It's the same operation. So the play value, the fun aspect of it can still be there even if you don't have as long of a train. So I would definitely think about, you know, maybe doing something on a little bit of a smaller scope if, you know, money's tight. So I think I'll leave it there for now. I've kind of talked myself to death. Hopefully I've at least provided some food for thought. If you like this video, then please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned and thanks for watching.